Welcome to this webinar being staged by the Office of Utilities Regulation here in Jamaica, entitled The Electricity Disaster Fund, a Shelter in the Storm. This topic is very timely given the impact of Hurricane Beryl in July and the Tropical Storm Raphael this week. While it's been around for a while, the Electricity Disaster Fund, or EDF, recently received some attention in the media and elsewhere. Work to establish this fund started well over 20 years ago and came into effect in 2008. But what is its purpose and how does it help with recovery efforts following a natural disaster? And what do the customers need to know about it? Well, I am Elizabeth Bennett Marsh. I am the public education specialist here at the OUR, and joining me today is Dr. Cedric Wilson. He is the Deputy Director General with oversight for the electricity and water and sewage portfolios here at the OUR. So the format of today's webinar is very simple. I'll be asking Dr. Cedric Wilson to make a presentation on this issue, and then we'll field your questions to him. So you don't have to wait until he completes his presentation. We ask you to, if you're joining us on our Facebook page or Instagram page, or on our YouTube page, just drop your questions in the chat and we'll post them to Cedric afterwards. We should also be joining live from PBCJ, so we welcome audiences on that platform as well, on the PBCJ YouTube platform. Without further ado, I hand over to Cedric. Cedric, welcome. Take it from here.
Thank you very much, Liz, and welcome to everybody who have joined this webinar. And I would say this, that for many Jamaicans, particularly those in the southwestern side of Jamaica, July 3rd and Hurricane Beryl is something that will be remembered for a very long time. Because Beryl was a force to reckon with. It was unlike any other hurricane for a number of reasons. First, no other Atlantic tropical cyclone has achieved a Category 5 status in such a short time, or as early as that. Normally, we see hurricanes reaching Category 3 level in the middle of August, but this one actually took place at the end of June. And so this is really a phenomenon. The second thing is that the rapid intensification is like no other, in the sense that it moved quickly from a mere tropical depression to a major hurricane. I think it took about 42 hours to reach that level. So this was really a phenomenon. It was really a force. And it had a big impact. 65% of JPS customers were out of electricity as a result of the hurricane. And it took in all 2 months to restore electricity service to all customers. There were a considerable amount of damage on the grid, and you can see it on the right side of your screen, where lots of poles, over 5,000 poles damaged, conductor span was down, transformers were damaged, and all of that. And a preliminary estimate indicate that the damage to the system will cost, in terms of restoration efforts, it will cost about US 26.1 million. But in the real sense of the event itself, I think we were very fortunate. Fortunate in 2 respects. Firstly, the eye of the hurricane never made landfall. It kept to the south of the island. So that was one good thing. The second thing is that the Electricity Disaster Fund has been around for a little while, and for the space of 12 years, we haven't had a hurricane disaster, so to speak, since Hurricane Sandy in 2012. So the question, therefore, that people have been asking is, how has the Electric Disaster Fund benefited electricity customers? That is the question. And of course, this shows the path of Hurricane Beryl from as it moved across the Caribbean and then dissipated itself somewhere on the North American continent. Now, to get into the electricity fund, first of all, we need to think in terms of how it really came about. And it started in the 1990s. Hurricane Andrew was a powerful and devastating hurricane which affected the Bahamas, Florida, and Louisiana. It caused 65 fatalities, and the cost associated with it was, at the time, the highest ever of $27.3 billion. But when that occurred, because it was such a big hurricane, the people providing insurance to the electricity sector started to rethink everything. The first thing they did, they went back to the two earlier decades, the 70s and the 80s, and did some analysis. And what came out of that is that tropical cyclone between 1980 and 1990 had moved from 83 in that decade to 133 in the 90s. Then what was evident was that the hurricanes, which is a subset of tropical cyclones, showed a 23% increase in 1990 over 1980. And then major hurricanes, we're talking about category 3 upwards. In the 1980s, there was only 17, and in 1990, there was 25. So they started to detect a pattern, and by the end of the 1990s, the insurance providers were very reluctant to offer insurance for the electricity T&D grid. That was the situation, actually. So the insurance challenge that was facing JPS and indeed the electricity utilities across the Caribbean and the southeastern part of the US was most insurance were no longer providing coverage for T&D assets. Insurance of the T&D assets had become expensive, with premiums ranging between 15% to 20% of the value of the assets, which is pretty high. And also, they were setting deductibles at 5 to 10% of the value of the assets. And the other thing is that since the middle of the 80s, the insurance industry had changed the rules somewhat, because partial insurance wasn't a good option because of the introduction of what was called the average cost, which what it means is that if you insured 3/4 of the asset, if your insurance is 3/4 of the value of the total assets, if there's a damage and you put in a claim, you'll be only getting 3/4 of the verified claim. Then there was the market for T&D insurance. While they were reluctant at first, more and more increasingly, credible insurance companies, they weren't offering any insurance at all for the T&D assets. So it started with most of them, and then eventually it had reached a stage where virtually all. For example, JPS had approached 45 companies in 2004, and none of them were interested in a serious way. And those that were interested were offering very high premiums, which was not really practical given the nature of the business that we are in. So the question is, without insurance, what other option was available? And what existed at the time was a price cap regime for tariff, which what that price cap did was put an upper limit as to how much electricity price can go to. But also with that price cap formula, there is what we call a Z factor component, which addresses exogenous situation, exogenous variables, such as hurricane, natural disaster, and that kind of thing. Taxes that are unexpected. And that is the way hurricanes would have been dealt with without any insurance. According to how we define that Z factor, it is applicable when the event affects JPS's costs. It is applicable when the event is not due to JPS's managerial decision, and it is applicable when the events are not captured by elements of the tariff itself. So that is what would trigger a Z factor application. And in the context that insurance was not available, what it means is that if you have a hurricane, you'd have to use a Z factor, which would be applied to customers' bill, and invariably they would see a jump in their bill immediately after the hurricane had occurred. So that was what was available outside of insurance. So what happened is that the utility JPS approached the OER in 2004 in its tariff application with the idea of an electricity disaster fund, or at the time, what they call it was a self-insurance fund. And what it involves is really saving for the rainy day, which means that they would be putting aside a predetermined amount for disaster events in that fund. It also means that these funds would be able to generate additional inflows because they would be invested in fairly safe assets, which would be good for the fund. And also the fund would be reviewed periodically to ensure its adequacy. And it would, of course, reduce, if not eliminate, the need to resort to Z factor adjustments. So what JPS proposed in 2004 was this. The predetermined premium would be about $2 million annually, which represented at the time approximately 5% of the value of the T&D assets. The target amount that would be kept in the electricity disaster fund was $10 million. And that was based on the idea that Gilbert, which took place in 1988, had caused damages to the tune of approximately $9 million US. So they think the idea at the time was that $10 million would be adequate in the event of a hurricane, a big hurricane. And then the projection was to realize this target over a 5-year period, viewing in the view that or hoping that no hurricane would have taken place at least for 5 years. So what are the developments with respect to the Electricity Disaster Fund over time? First, the OER approved the fund in 2004 June. Then in 2008, rules specific to the funds were formalized. And after that, or since 2004, people have been paying money in their rates through the fund, and that amounts to $2 million in some years. And then between 2008 and 2014, it was $5 million that went into the fund on an annual basis, on the basis of what customers contributed in their rates, in their energy rates. I should, of course, also mention that that particular decade of the 2000s was a very busy period in terms of hurricanes and cyclones. And then in 2014, since that time, $2 million have been flowing into the fund based on customers' contribution into the fund up to the present day, which is how many years? 10 years after. So we have been contributing to the fund in that respect. The rules were established because we have to be very clear as to what the objectives and purpose of the funds are, and to ensure that they are used in a particular way. So the rules, the purpose of the fund was really to provide restoration services in the case of a disaster. That was the whole idea, to be able to restore services quickly. So the objective really was to reduce the uncertainty with respect to funding restoration activities. Two, it was to facilitate efficient restoration in the shortest possible time. And three, it was to minimize the financial impact on ratepayers. So those were the objectives and the purpose of the fund. The rule set out several things. One, it distinguished the role of the utility as opposed to the role of the regulator. It addressed the financing of the EDF. It dealt with investments, and it is significant to note that the approach to investment was a very conservative approach. So the aim was to achieve a reasonable rate of return on the fund, to avoid unnecessary risk, and maintain liquidity in the fund, that whenever an event occurs, money would be available to fund the restoration exercise. It also deals with audits. Audits are to be done annually, once a year, and by an independent auditor. And it also dealt with how the processing of claims should be handled, how it should be submitted, and how it should be evaluated. So those things shows what should be done and what cannot be done in terms of the fund itself. So the question therefore is, how has the fund performed? What you'll notice in the top right-hand diagram is that during the first decade of the 21st century, we have had quite a few hurricanes. There was Ivan in 2004. In 2005, we had three hurricanes that affected the grid: Dennis, Emily, and Wilma. In 2007, there was Hurricane Dean. In 2008, Gustav, and Sandy in 2012. And what the diagram does is to show you the path of these various hurricanes. Actually, only two went, we had landfall of the eye of the hurricane, Sandy and a tropical storm Gustav. The others, the eye did not make landfall, fortunately for us. But what we notice about the 7 cyclones that we experienced between 2004 and 2012 is that these 7 cyclones resulted in damages amounting, based on JPS's claim, $53.5 million. When we examined it, we actually gave JPS 34.4 million, and that is US dollars. And of that amount, 7.4 million came from the Z factor, and the other 27 million actually came from the Electricity Disaster Fund. So in that sense, the fund has played a significant role in dealing with restoration costs. And I should explain that while the fund has existed from 2004, when we had Hurricane Ivan, it came 3 months after the fund was established, and the money in the fund was not sufficient to address the problems or the cost associated with Ivan. So it had to come from the Z factor, which is allowed in the rate. Subsequently, all the other costs associated with the hurricanes, 9.6 million in the case of Ivan, and the others have all came from the Electricity Disaster Fund. The performance. In June, just before the hurricane, the total amount in the Electricity Disaster Fund was 59.6 million US dollars. And that represents approximately 11% of JPS's total assets, to the T&D assets, transmission and distribution assets. And the target really was for 15%. So that was the situation in June. What you have noticed is that between 2014 and 2024 June, the fund has grown by $33 million over that 10-year period. Perhaps about 2/3 of it coming from the contribution made by customers, and the other third comes from the interest rates on the fund. Currently, customers pay about 12 Jamaican cents per kilowatt hour towards the fund, and that turns out to be about 19 Jamaican dollars per month if for the average customer who consumes about 150 kilowatt hours per month. So that is really the contribution to the fund by ratepayers. So the question, therefore, is what are the benefits of the fund? First, lower rates. The second is a smoother electricity price trajectory. And the third is the earlier restoration of service. By way of lower electricity rates, if we were taking insurance, and I'm assuming that we could find it somehow, based on the information we had at the time when the fund was established, the premiums per year would be 15% of the value of the T&D assets, which means that people would be required to pay approximately $70 $78 million US dollars. JPS would be paying $78 million US dollars towards insurance, as opposed to the $2-3 million that customers currently pay now. Secondly, if there was no insurance available, there would be Z factor adjustments, and the Z factor adjustments would be higher because it includes interest costs, because these payments are made after the fact, and JPS would have to be borrowing money in order to get these things in place, and it would also be captured in the interest costs associated with it would be captured in the rates. When we talk about the smoother electricity trajectory, is that normally when you have a Z factor adjustment, it is usually done in 2 years, 1-2 years, which makes it a bit lumpy. And as a result of that, if you have a smooth 2 million or 3 million US dollars like we have since 2014, it is much better than having your rates jacked up as a result of a hurricane for a couple of years. So it's a smoother way of dealing with the payments. And when we talk about restorations of service in an earlier time, what we're talking about is that funding the inventory purchases before the event. What the fund provides for is allowing JPS to get funds upfront before a hurricane that they can stock up before the hurricane season, so that when the event comes, they'll have enough poles and conductors and insulators and works in order to address the problem. Also, what happens is that after the event, they won't have to be looking for loans to borrow. The fund allows JPS to get financial advances, which would help them to deal with the cash flow difficulties after the event. So there are a number of benefits associated with the Electricity Disaster Fund. And I think, in a sense, when we look at it, it represents a shelter in a storm indeed. And this is what I have to say about the fund. So it's over to you to ask me questions now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. If you're just joining us or you joined us late, I am Elizabeth Bennett Marsh, the Public Education Specialist at the Office of Utilities Regulation in Jamaica. And you just heard from Dr. Cedric Wilson, our Deputy Director General with responsibility for the electricity and water and sewage portfolios here at the OUR. So Cedric would have chronicled many issues pertaining to the Electricity Disaster Fund, which impacts all of us as customers and consumers of electricity. He chronicled the factors which gave rise to the establishment of the EDF, including the increase in the number of natural events, practically one per year between 2004 and 2012. In one instance, we had 2 cyclones coming near to us in 1 year. Cedric also spoke about the lack of adequate insurance to cover the transmission and distribution assets of the JPS, and that would have also impacted delivery and the objectives and the rules of the fund and OUR's role in approving and monitoring the use of funds. So over to you for questions. If you have any, just drop them in the chat. But I do have a few questions for you, Cedric.
Sure.
Because one of the first things I wanted to find out is, JPS has what we call a revenue cap arrangement, and I'm sure you'll be explaining that to the listeners exactly what it means in answering my question about whether the electricity disaster funds, can be used to pay revenue to the JPS as per this revenue cap arrangement that's now in place for them.
Yes, indeed. We actually moved from a price cap to a revenue cap in 2016. What the revenue cap is really all about is that for each year, JPS is assigned a particular level of revenue. Now, if JPS sales are lower than that revenue, then the targeted sales associated with that revenue, what it means is the following year, customers will have to pay for the gap in revenue that JPS didn't meet in the previous year, and vice versa. Should JPS sell more energy kilowatt hours than was targeted, the following year rates would go down because of the gap. Or what I should say, rates would go down because JPS had over recovered in the previous year. So that is how the revenue cap work. What normally happens when you have a hurricane is that JPS revenue, because a lot of customers might be out of power for some time, the revenue might not be the amount that was targeted. Now, the question is, should the fund pay for that? The fund is only to deal with restoration costs and not revenue. So that would not be covered as a part of the electricity disaster fund. In fact, in 2004, when we had Ivan, JPS actually applied for compensation for revenue loss, and we denied it as a part of the claim. And it was even taken to the tribunal, and the tribunal agreed with JPS, agreed with the OER, sorry, that revenues is not a part of the electricity disaster fund. So that has not changed.
Okay, so and the tribunal of which you speak is the Electricity Appeals Tribunal, which to which JPS can go for any mediation, let's put it that way, of any dispute with the OUR.
Yeah, that's
Cedric,
correct, Liz.
so we're clear that the funds cannot be used to shore up the potential revenue of JPS for any particular year under the revenue cap arrangement. But can it be used to lower the fuel rates in the event of a hurricane? We recall there was also some talk immediately after Beryl when persons got their bills, and it was attributed in part to an alternative energy source which had to be used. And so the issue arose as to whether can we dip into the EDF and help to shore up the fuel rates so that the impact would be less? Can it be used for that?
No, according to the rules, no, that isn't the case, because the idea is that it is a substitute for insurance. So in that context, it is to deal with infrastructural damages, damages related to poles, transformers, substations, and I would say transmission and distribution, not generation assets. Strictly transmission, because those are the assets that are most exposed when it comes to hurricanes and cyclones and earthquakes. Those are the most vulnerable assets out there.
Yeah. You would also have given persons who are on our webinar today an idea as to how much JPS would have drawn down on the fund since this year in preparation for and post burial. Is it likely that following the drawdown from the funds customers could see an increase in rates? And if so, why?
Um, actually, right now we have a preliminary claim submission from JPS that the damages, the restoration cost damages that they are seeing is somewhere in the region of $26 million, which means that all other things being equal, the fund would be reduced from 56 million to somewhere in the region of 25 to $30 million. So what this means is that there would be a big reduction in the fund. And like is the case of insurance, where premiums tend to go up in the immediate aftermath of a hurricane, there might be consideration of increasing it from $2 million, the inflow from $2 million to a higher level to ensure that we might not be out of pocket if there is an event next year, God forbid, or very shortly after.
Yeah. And you did mention in your presentation, Cedric, that the ideal situation is to have in the fund at least 15%
Yeah,
of the
that's right.
value of the T&D assets. And right now we have about 10 to 12%, and it's slated to get even lower with the drawdown as a result of barrel restoration, etc.
Yeah, to be quite honest, JPS has assets right now of about $522 million. T&D assets, US dollars. So to get to that 15%, it would be approximately $78 million to $80 million. So that would
Right.
be the comfort level that we would have for the fund. In all the years we have been trying to get to 15%, we have never ever gotten there. And in fact, this is the closest that we have ever gotten to it. So I
Yes.
think it might be necessary for us to make some effort to get to that level. And in that process, which we will have to look at as the regulator and as the utility, and to consider whether it might be reasonable to increase the level of inflows into the fund and how much that increase ought to be.
Yeah. And just to give a perspective, Cedric, and to reiterate a part of your presentation, it may have slipped some viewers today. You had highlighted, and I'm just paraphrasing, for persons who are consuming about 200 kilowatt hours per month, they're paying just under 20 Jamaican dollars towards the EDF. And I'm just summarizing your thing just to give persons an idea as to exactly how much they're actually paying towards the EDF on a monthly basis right now. It's about 20 Jamaican dollars per month. Cedric, the issue arose again in the last few weeks about who has access to the fund. You were at pains to identify the purpose of the fund, which is to help restore the T&D assets of the electricity provider. And just to reiterate, there is no other entity, body, etc., that has access to the fund.
Yes, that's correct. JPS has access to the fund, but they cannot take anything out of the fund without the OER permission. So they had to get money from the fund for whatever reason. It has to be justified. It has to be done on some basis that is rooted in the rules. And we at the OER would give JPS permission. And on withdrawing those funds, JPS would have, I think, within 3 days, I think, to indicate, to notify that those funds have been withdrawn. And so nobody can access a fund without the JPS, without OUR's permission, really. Additionally, every month money comes into the fund by way of the rates paid by customers, and JPS is required within 2 weeks to deposit those money in designated bank accounts. So that is how the fund operate in terms of access and inflows into the fund in general.
Mhm. Which leads me to my next question, and I think my final question as we prepare to wrap up, Cedric, is how does the OUR, as the one that monitors the use of the fund, ensures that the fund is being used for the purpose it is being used for, and that monies are going in as per the stipulation set out by the OUR?
Well, one of the things about the fund is that the rules are really tight, and it includes audit. There are annual audits which looks at the inflows into the fund, the timing in which these funds are deposited, withdrawals from the funds if there are any, and this is done every year. And we are very serious about that at the OER because we want to ensure that the funds are where they should be and the funds are at the level that they should be, so that whenever there is an event, the fund can actually provide for them.
Thank you very much, Cedric. And I think this is where we're going to leave our webinar for today. Thank you very much for any questions that were posed, etc. And thank you, Cedric, for taking the time out of your schedule to just inform members of the public here and abroad about this very, very important issue. We want you to know that you can always go back and watch this webinar, share the link with persons who did not get a chance to watch it live. The link is still the same as the live link. We want to also thank the hardworking team behind the scenes who made it happen. Producer was Gordon Brown. Thank you very much, Gordon. And Gordon is our public affairs coordinator here at the OUR. Our social media and graphics team, Jody and Lawrence and Dashana Jackson, who are also providing support behind the scenes for this live transmission today. And of course, we had technical support from Lestine Rose of TTN Media. This webinar will be on our YouTube page, as I said before, the OUR Jamaica Hub. Subscribe to our page so you can be among the first to know when the next webinar will be held, and also get weekly updates from the OUR. I am Elizabeth Bennett Marsh, the Public Education Specialist here at the OUR. Until next time we meet, take care.